Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 15 in our continuing study of the book of Proverbs. We're in that one verse maximum section, chapters 20 through 24, the Proverbs of Solomon. And in that, we noted that chapters 10 through 15 are on the theme of the righteous and the wicked versus the wicked. And we're coming to the close of that section. Next time, we'll be looking at living the wise life, and then in the future, words of the wise. Chapter 15, verse 1, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Notice things that you're saying here. Verse 2, the tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable, but the mouth of fool spouts folly. Each one of these is a contrast, and the contrasts are over things that you say. The eyes of the Lord, by the way, notice it makes acceptable. We're going to see that. The term hey, tiv, actually that tiv part, we're going to see that later on translated as good. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, watching over the evil and the good. So acceptable, good. Wish they'd have translated it the same way. And then a soothing tongue is a tree of life, but perversion in it crushes the spirit. So each one of these are things that are said. We continue into verse 5. A fool rejects his father's discipline, but he who regards reproof is sensible. Verse 6. Great wealth is in the house of the righteous, but trouble is the income. Notice there's a sort of financial theme there in verse 6. Great wealth is in the house of the righteous, but trouble in the income of the wicked. There is in the income of the wicked. And then verse 7, the lips of the wise spread knowledge, but the hearts of fools are not so. Now, what we have is the importance, we had that speaking theme in the previous section, still on speaking, but now it's the importance of receiving instruction, of receiving discipline, of receiving reproof, of hearing the lips from wise and the hearts of fools. They're not interested in that sort of thing. Verse 8, the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord. We're still on that importance of receiving instruction. So we have the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord. I circle that word because we're going to see it repeated. But the prayer of the upright is his delight. And then verse 9, the way of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord. So you had the sacrifice of the wicked, and now the way of the wicked, it's an abomination to the Lord. But he loves one who pursues righteousness, so the upright and the righteous. Verse 10, by the way, notice, so we had that abomination theme. Now in verse 10, notice the term reproof. We're going to see that when we get to the last part of verse 10. Grievous punishment is for him who forsakes the way. He who hates reproof will die. Notice receiving instruction. The one who doesn't like to be reproved, he doesn't like to receive instruction, he's going to die. Now, the reason I made a point of abomination in verses 8 and 9 and then reproof in verse 10 is we're going to see that carried over into the next section. So, verse 11, Sheol and Abaddon lie open before the Lord. That's that abomination sort of thing. How much more the hearts of men. And so that refers to back to verse 8 and 9, that abomination theme. And then verse 12, a scoffer does not love one who reproves him. Remember, we talked about reproof. He will not go to the wise. And so there we have that reproof idea. It relates to verse 10 and completes this whole section. So we had these themes, and then we saw them, and then they were repeated in these three verses. Next, we go to verse 13. A joyful heart makes a cheerful face. Now, we're going to see that repeated when we get to the end of verse 15. All the days of the afflicted are bad, but a cheerful heart has a continual peace. So a joyful heart and a cheerful heart. And that's forming an inclusio with the first line of verse 13 and the last line of verse 15. That makes for an inclusio. This whole section is going to be sort of bound together as we read it. So let's look at that. The joyful heart makes a cheerful face, but when the heart is sad, the spirit is broken. Verse 14, the mind of the intelligent seeks knowledge, but the mouth of fools, notice mouth and mind and mouth, the fools and the intelligent, that feeds on folly. And then all the days of the afflicted are bad, but a cheerful heart has a continuing a continual feast. Notice it feeds on folly, but by contrast, the cheerful heart, there's a continual feeding, a continual feast. So we pull all these together in the big idea here is the joy of learning God's path, his truth, his way. Verse 16, better, and we're going to have a couple, two different better than, better this and that. So better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and turmoil with it. And then verse 17, better is a dish of vegetables where love is than a fattened ox served with hatred. Now, if you're a vegetarian, you might not get the point of that, but not everybody could afford to eat meat back then. So vegetables were, that was common food, but a real feast, a good thing, was when you got to eat meat. And that's the point in that second better. This is better than that. So better a dish of vegetables where love is. If love is there, then that's okay what you're eating. Than a fattened ox served with hatred. So notice the turmoil, the hatred. I'm seeing a common theme. A hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but the slow to anger calms a dispute. So I've got the hot-tempered and the slow to anger, and then the dispute. And what we're seeing here, notice turmoil, hatred, strife, tempered anger, is conflict resolution. And the point is that conflict ruins the celebration. That's why, you can have just a little bit rather than great treasure with turmoil, or just a little bit of food than a big fattened ox with hatred. Conflict ruins the celebration. Verse 19, the way of the lazy is as a hedge of thorns, but the path of the upright, notice the way and the path are speaking of the same thing, the path of the upright is a highway. Now, notice that lazy here is contrasted not with industrious or hardworking, but lazy is contrasted with upright. We don't usually think of those two as a contrast, but the writer of the Proverbs does picture that he does contrast those two. What's the opposite of lazy? Not just being industrious, but being upright. Verse 20, a wise son makes his father glad, but a foolish man despises his mother. Now, wise and foolish have been contrasted all through these, ever since chapter 10 all the way to chapter 15, where we are now. Verse 21, folly is a joy to him who lacks sense, but a man of understanding walks straight. Again, notice the one who is in folly, he lacks sense. The man of understanding isn't just knowing where he's going, but he is walking straight. There's a certain ethical quality to his walk. Verse 22, without consultation, plans are frustrated, but with many counselors, that is the plans, succeed. Now, in all of these, there is a common theme. The common theme is plans and paths, knowing where you're going, planning where you're going, and then walking in a correct way to get there. Verse 23, we're still on the plans and paths. Verse 23, a man has joy in an apt answer, and how delightful is a timely word. Have you ever had that experience of in a situation where you're confronted with something and you have just the right thing to say? You you almost wanted to take notes about on yourself. I've made that comment before. Verse 24, the path of life leads upward for the wise, that he may keep away from Sheol below. Now, Sheol is the term for the grave. It actually has a few different ideas. Sort of the place of the dead. Well, a grave is where dead people go, but it can also refer to it symbolically as well. And because the translators didn't want to necessarily capture only one or two of those ideas, they just gave it the Hebrew word. They just transliterated it in Hebrew, Sheol, and I'm glad they did that. That's a good decision. So notice this is a contrast, even though it's finishing the thought. Path of life versus Sheol is contrasted. Verse 25: the Lord will tear down the house of the proud, but He will establish the boundary of the widow. Now notice the proud and the widow are being contrasted. We usually think proud and humble, or widow and married, but the widow in that culture would have been both maybe destitute, but also shamed. It was an honor and shame culture. And so these are indeed contrasts. And remember, this is the idea, and we're going to see this at the end of our proverb as well, that the Lord resists the proud, and that he honors and he takes care of the humble. And that's the idea here in verse 25. Verse 26, evil plans are an abomination to the Lord, but pleasant words are pure. Notice plans and paths. That's been our overall theme in this section. Verse 27, he who profits illicitly troubles his own house, but he who hates bribes will live. Now, the Proverbs talk a number of times about bribes. It was just, let me just say, it was just a way of life in the ancient world. And in many third world countries today, it is still just a way of life. But that doesn't make it right. And so notice, he who profits illicitly, like in giving and taking bribes and things like that, troubles his own house. He may get what he wants in certain areas, but he's actually laying the seeds for difficult times. But he who hates bribes will live. Bribes are not the way to go, even though a natural wisdom says, well, they work, but God's wisdom says something different. Verse 28, the heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Verse 29, the Lord is far from the wicked. Notice how we went righteous, wicked, wicked, righteous. So the Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayer of the righteous. And so we have throughout this, even in verse 27, which doesn't actually use the term righteous or wicked, we have the righteous versus the wicked in contrast in this section. Verse 30, bright eyes gladden the heart. Now, let me just say, that's a little bit difficult. Actually, they've translated it literally, but sometimes a literal translation can miss what's going on. So the term there, meor ayanim, ayan is your eye, and then the im is plural, and meor is sort of a thing that brings light. So or is a word for light, and meor is like something that brings light. In fact, remember how in Genesis chapter 1 you have the greater light and the lesser light. You know, it's a reference to the sun and the moon in that context. That's the meor, the thing that gives light or reflects light. Well, bright eyes gladden the heart. You can see that's a literal translation, but it might not get the idea across. And so the King James version renders it the light of the eyes. Again, that's accurate. What does that mean? The light of the eyes gladdens the heart. Or the New International Version, light in a messenger's eyes. Again, they're trying to get the point across. Or the New English Translation, a bright look. Okay, a little bit like bright eyes that our New American Standard here has got. And then the New Jerusalem Bible, a kindly glance, which actually might give the idea of bright eyes. In other words, what are bright eyes? It might have the idea of a kindly glance. And that gladdens the heart. Notice the next part, good news puts fat on the bones. So bright eyes are contrasted with good news, or compared. Actually, it's not really a contrast; it's a comparison. It's two different ways of saying the same thing. Verse 31, he whose ear listens to the life-giving reproof. Notice how we went from eyes to ears, although ears are involved in getting the good news. Verse 31, he whose ear listens to the life-giving reproof will dwell among the wise. Now, this is a synthetic parallel where you begin the idea and then you complete it in the second line. So it's not contrasted, it's just finishing the idea. We haven't seen a lot of those, but we've seen occasionally that sort of synthetic parallelism in this section of the Proverbs. Verse 32, he who neglects discipline despises himself, but he who listens to reproof acquires understanding. Notice there's a listening ear in a few of these. Good news, and the ear listens, and the one who neglects discipline, and the one who listens to reproof. There's a common theme there. Then verse 33, the fear of the Lord is the instruction for wisdom. Now, it's almost like we've come full circle in this section of the Proverbs, not just going back to chapter 10, but in a sense, going all the way back to chapter 1, verse 7. Remember that talked about the fear of the Lord. So the fear of the Lord is the instruction for wisdom, and before honor comes humility. Now, when he says before honor comes humility, that's actually going to be a phrase that's repeated. We're going to see that later on in the Proverbs. That section of the Proverbs is going to be echoed later on. That's an idea that will be repeated. That honor versus humility, we normally think of those as opposites. But the writer of the Proverbs says, no, before you get honor, you get humility, and that brings you honor. Why? Because of the fear of the Lord, because the Lord himself is involved in that. And so this is going to be the conclusion, not just of this chapter, but this entire section, chapters 10 through 15. And it reminds me a little bit of what Jesus said, Matthew chapter 23, verse 12. Remember, he says, whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. That's what this proverb is saying. And that's spoken by the one who humbled himself, being born in as a human being, not in a king's palace, but in the most poor circumstances, laid in a manger, and not only there, but also humbled himself, according to Philippians chapter 2, to the point of death, even the death of a cross, so that in paying the penalty for our sins, in saving us, he might both bring many sons to glory, so that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. That's the honor, that Jesus Christ is Lord.